Good evening, everyone. It is such a wonderful day for us today. I'm Neeta Aneja, and I'm the founder of Trends, which is the platform for art, cultural, social, and literary experiences. By profession, I'm an international sourcing specialist as founder of Trends International. And for the love of art, culture, social, and literary experiences, Trends is a passionate endeavor. With me is my co-host and my daughter Shreya. She's a budding architect and she's also a spoken word poetess. In fact, in July this year, we started this series, author interaction series, just to carry our love of reading and literature and writing forward. In fact, I would say that dreams are indeed timeless. Dreams are not what you see in sleep. It is something which does not let you sleep. So I'll really like to introduce you today to our most eminent author, Amish. And lovely to have you with us, Amish. Amish, as you all know, is a diplomat, author, and a columnist. He has, in fact, taken over as the director of Nehru Center in London fairly recently, just before the lockdown. In fact, he's been listed as 50 most powerful Indians by India Today magazine and by Forbes. He's one of the top most celebrated celebrities of India today. He's also an Eisenhower Fellow. He's an alumni of IIM Calcutta, and he's worked for 14 years in the financial industry. He's been a banker. Coming back to his writing, we all know that he published his first book in 2010, and since then there have been around 8 books, one bestseller, more bestseller than the other. In fact, all his books have sold over 5.5 million copies. In fact, his books have been translated into 10 Indian languages and 8 international languages. So welcome, Amish. Welcome to our platform. And I'm really very grateful to my very dear friend, Vikram Sampath, for connecting us together.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure, Neeta.
First of all, Amish, just to carry the conversation forward, how has your journey been? It's very interesting to note that you've been a management graduate from the top university in India. Then you were into your corporate career for 14 years in the financial sector. Then into one of the best-selling authors India has ever produced. Then to a diplomat and now a film producer. So we'd like to know your journey from you.
Yeah, clearly I had no focus. I guess perhaps the best way I can explain things, my journey, is life is what happens to you while you're planning other things. One makes decisions based on what options are available in front of you at that point of time, right? I'm 45, so which means I have seen enough of the pre-1991 India, when there were no opportunities. We had, of course, regrettably chosen socialism as an economic policy, and socialism has an unparalleled record of utter and complete failure wherever it has been tried. Failed in India as well. There were no economic opportunities, and I come from a humble background, so we weren't from the elite India, so there weren't that many opportunities. So one had to be practical and pragmatic. I loved history as a subject when I was young. I loved reading, but no point of time did I ever think seriously of becoming a writer or anything. I mean, there's history, sab theek hai beta, kaam kya karoge? And when we were growing up, the real options were, either medicine or engineering or MBA or CA. That's it. And the other option was to starve. Right? So I did the pragmatic, practical thing, and did an MBA, worked in banking for 14 years. And then this idea struck me for a book which kept growing. But I wrote my first 2 books along with my job. I didn't. I'd love to sound romantic that that I kicked my boss and and went off to pursue my dream. But it was a very pragmatic decision. I resigned only after my second book, when my royalty check became more than my salary. So it was a very pragmatic decision. I thoroughly enjoyed my life. I enjoy my life as a full-time author. I actually, get to do something that I love doing, and I actually get paid for it. So life can't be better. And this role, this diplomatic role, is something that I was offered, that I was asked for. I'm a very, very patriotic person. I think this is, an opportunity for me to contribute something in my own small way to a culture and a country that I deeply love, which is, our Mother India. And if I can help propagate Mother India's culture in London and through London to the larger West, then I would have made a small contribution to our great land. That's how my journey has been. Opportunities come. It's not that you jump at every opportunity that comes. Then you're a bependi ka lota. But if an opportunity comes which appears exciting, then you must grab it. But grab it with the combination of your head and heart. Don't jump without thinking. That's the way I've lived my life.
Amish, I've been seeing all this lockdown. You've been really doing a lot of things with the Ministry of Culture there. You've been doing a lot of virtual interactions. I think you're really enjoying yourself being the Minister of Culture in Nehru Center. And the
yes, actually, that is my role here. I'm the Minister of Culture at the the Indian High Commission here, and Director of the Nehru Center. So I'm technically a diplomat. And yes, within a very short while of me landing here, COVID happened. I think the entire world has realized that the food habits of China is the global strategic issue. Everyone needs to get involved in there. But okay, but speaking with seriousness, I don't think anyone ever seriously imagined a situation like this. I mean, this is beyond the syllabus, right? I mean, it's out of syllabus. You can't plan for something like this. And to be honest, when the lockdown was announced in the UK, many of us genuinely thought it'll be a matter of a few weeks, things will come back on track. And we had tried, at that point of time, the focus was, keep our employees safe. Many of the protocols that had to be followed. The Indian government, took things very seriously. We used to get many more briefings. Though we are sitting in the UK, we would get briefings from the Indian government about the situation in UK rather than from the UK government. So the Indian government took it very seriously. And the first few weeks, all officers were helping because there were many Indians stuck here, and there were emergency flights, etc. We helped. All of us were helping out in that, and credit must go where it's due. I know bureaucrats are easy to criticize, but at this point of time, many of them really stretched, went beyond the call of duty. But I think the key thing to realize after a few weeks, we can't just that's what I was speaking to my team. We can't just sit around waiting for things to come back to normal. For all this is the new normal, and we are stuck in this. And many cultural centers in London have taken that call that they're just going to wait, which I think is a mistake. I mean, you may lose your clientele, you may lose, you'll not just lose fat, you lose muscle mass because you lose institutional memory for a year if you do nothing. So, and most of my staff, they may be, based in the UK, but they're of Indian origin. So I said, let's have the Indian attitude. Yeah, look at the silver lining. Everyone's at home, which means they're much more comfortable with online right now. Let's just jump in. Yeah, fine. We can't do physical events because it's banned. We can't. We're not allowed to have more than 6 people. And from the looks of it, till March, April next year, it's impossible to have physical events. So we decided to take the plunge and move things online. And actually, it's been a blessing in disguise because Nehru Center's share of voice has just shot up. We have an auditorium right here, and I'm at the Nehru Center office right now. We have an auditorium here. It's 130, 135 seater capacity right here in central London in Mayfair. So which meant that was the capacity of our events, right? 130, 135 people. You can't have more than that. And that too only largely from central London. Now we have events where we have viewership of over 100,000, and we are reaching out not just to people across London, but people in the Midlands, in North England, in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland. So even to our artists who come on our platform, now we are giving them the entire nation of the UK as a market, right? And in fact, we end up reaching out to Indians as well, and Indians in America. So I say it's a blessing in disguise. We have grown dramatically. Our online properties have grown dramatically because of the amount of activity. They've all become verified. So the way I see it, look, there's no point crying about the situation you're in. That is a complete waste of time, right? And all of us are stuck in this situation. Think positive and figure out अभी ठीक है, अब ये यहाँ पे फंसे हुए हैं, अभी आगे क्या करना है? रोने का कोई फायदा नहीं है. So that's what we did, and actually it's worked out well for us.
And how about your writing? So you've been writing in the lockdown. You've been able to get time with all this work, so many virtual interviews. You're here with us today, and you've been really doing a lot in your capacity as well. So how about the writing? You're into your 4th edition of the Ramchandra trilogy also. Yeah.
No, fortunately, look, I'm a workaholic, so I really do very little in life besides work. I'm single. I'm staying by myself. There's no distraction, so I only work. I'm normally up by 5:30 every morning. I do my yoga pranayam and I write in the mornings. So my yoga pranayams are in the morning and exercises for the evening. So cycling or jogging. Now I've started cycling. I enjoy that a lot. Or rather, I've restarted cycling. And during the day, then I'm busy with Nehru Center work, and post my cycling in the evening is for reading. So that's my normal day. I'm a boring workaholic. Sorry to disappoint you.
I would say very, very enterprising workaholic. Now you're busy with the promotions of Sohail Dev, and then now the movie. I mean, you're doing so much. We're totally inspired.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, we've decided, because Sohail Dev is my latest book. For those who don't know, Legend of Sohail Dev. It's the king who saved India. It's based on an actual historical figure who lived 1,000 years ago. The book was released a few months back. God's grace has been doing very well. It's been #1 on the bestseller charts. In India, it's sold well in other countries as well, including in the UK. And this is the story of perhaps the most consequential Indian hero who you've not heard of. Because and we've suffered horrific invasions for the last 1,000 years. First the Turkic invasions, and then the European invasions. And those we call Delhi Sultans, Mughals, etc. They weren't Indians, no matter what Bollywood films tell you. They weren't Indian Muslims. They were foreigners. They were Turks. They didn't look Indian. To us, they would have looked Chinese. Yeah, so very similar to the kind of invaders we are facing in the modern day as well, in look. But the Turks were originally from Central Asia, and they were the military superpower of the world from the 11th to the 17th century. They didn't just attack and destroy India. They attacked and destroyed the Arab world, much of Europe, and all over the world. I mean, they were. Timur was a Turk, for example. Timur the Lame. And he killed 5% of the world's population, 800 years ago. And remember, at that time, there were no nuclear bombs, there was no dynamite, there were no machine guns. It wasn't easy to kill people in those days. I'm putting the morality aside, I'm just saying just the technology of it. Because you had swords, you had knives, you had to stab, you had to be. It wasn't easy to kill someone, right? And with that technology, in that age, Timur killed 5% of the world's population. The Turks, and you have to read of them as a race. They aren't originally from Turkey, actually. Turkey was actually Greek. The Turks conquered that territory and massacred all the Greeks. The Turks are originally from Central Asia, and they were a race designed just for war, nothing else. All they did was kill. And like I said, I mean, if you can kill 5% of the world's population, imagine their brutality. Now, this kind of race, Mahmud Ghazni was also a Turk. He attacked India in the 1020s. And the next Turkic invasion was by Muhammad Ghori, who came in the 1190s. So for nearly 160, 170 years, no Turkic tribe dared to invade India. Right? It's a fascinating story. At a point of time when they were going around massacring much of the known world, why didn't they attack India for 160 years? Because of this man, King Sohail Dev. He fought a battle in 1034 against the invading Ghaznavid Turkic army called the Battle of Bahraich, which is Bahraich is in modern UP. and he defeated the Turks, and he followed the path of Lord Krishna more than Lord Ram, King Suheldev. So his attitude was, have you heard of that line, Shate Shatyam Samacharit? Yeah? That dusht ke saath dushtata hi karni chahiye. That if you are battling a ruthless person, speak to that ruthless person in a language he understands. Okay. Don't try and be kind to a ruthless person. Right? So King Suheldev killed every single one of the Turks, didn't leave one person alive. And it was such a devastating defeat that no Turks came back to India for 160 years. None of the other Turkic tribes. And King Suheldev was from a subaltern caste. Okay, he put together a united army, Hindus of all castes, Indian Muslims, Buddhists. It is such an inspiring story. Right? A story we need to hear today. Story of unity, story of strength. And he's been airbrushed sadly out of our history books. And when I heard of it, I was really inspired. Wanted this book to come out. And the decision to produce also, my first book had been rejected, Immortals of Melua, by every publisher it was sent to. I finally self-published my first book because my thought was, if others don't back me, the hell with it. I'll back myself and try करेंगे. ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा क्या होगा, flop हो जाएगा. So and various movie deals have happened for my book, so the rights have come back. Things haven't, worked out. So the decision was, चलो movies में भी वैसे ही करते हैं. Let's do it ourselves. So we have formed a company. We've got partners, and we are going ahead.
Absolutely, all over the place. We have been hearing about it so much, and we are very keen to know who's going to be your idol, Suheldev. Who are you planning? So it's still a secret.
Have to wait. That the director will decide. There are various discussions, but
I'm sure.
We'll announce in due course.
I read somewhere you had, you have a few people in mind, but as you said, it must be the director's prerogative.
And we'll announce it.
There's so many readers today who have all read your book, and they're here, and they'll be asking you questions on Suheldev. So
I have to actually, yes, I'll just jump in here. First of all, I have to say I'm so privileged to be talking to you right now. I think it was almost 8 years back when I was 14 when I first read your book, and since then till now it's just been a journey. So it's been amazing, and today talking to you is just
Thank you.
I cannot contain my excitement. So I have a question for you. So what I wanted to ask you is that for me, back then when I started reading your books, I was not really into mythology at all. And now also I know a lot of people that their primary source of information of mythology actually comes from books like yours. And, there is so much of information there, of course, factual and also turned into fiction, that I have to ask you that when you're writing, how do you, balance the gray line between mythological fiction and what we perhaps think to be true? How do you draw that gray line? How does that work?
Very good question. I think I follow the paths that have been set out by our ancient writers, by our ancestors, actually. What has happened sadly over the last few centuries, we've forgotten a lot of our ancient way. And especially the last 70 years, our education system was such that we learn very little, which is unfortunate. So therefore, we don't have an idea of how varied our ancient interpretations were. I think the key difference between the Indian way, and in fact, actually the way of much of the ancient world, of which only India has survived, because all the rest of the ancient world was all wiped out. Zoroastrian Persia, Pharaonic Egypt, pagan, Greco-Roman, they were all massacred, they were all killed. Their temples were destroyed, their universities were burned to the ground. We are the only ones who survived. The difference between the ancient way and the path that emerged in the last 2000 years is the approach to truth. Okay. Middle Eastern and Western approaches, and every way has its strength and weakness. I'm not criticizing anything. Every way has its strength and weakness. Middle Eastern and Western approach, which has now become the global approach, is that there is one truth. And you better believe in that one truth, because if you don't, you will go to hell and burn for eternity. And God himself will ensure that you will burn for eternity. Right? And this at times would be taken to an extremism where they would actually invade countries and kill people to save them. I know it sounds bizarre to us because we don't have those concepts. You know? But they genuinely believe they either have to convert or kill you to save you. Okay. And it's because of this, the fundamental concept is there is only one truth. Okay. Whereas all ancient pagan ways, of which India has survived, is the concept that there may be one truth at the divine level, but for all of us human beings, there are multiple truths. And your truth is also okay. My truth is also okay. I don't have the right to force my truth on you. You don't have the right to force your truth on me. And this to me is the foundation of liberalism. You will find over the last 2000 years, many idol rejecting cultures, primarily Europeans and Turks, have gone around the world massacring hundreds of millions of people simply because they worshipped idols. There are enough cases, not just in India, across the world. Right? And destroying their temples and burning their universities and and all that. You find almost no case study of the reverse, of idol worshipping cultures going around the world massacring people who don't worship idols. You notice that? Not just in India. Did pharaonic Egyptians go around massacring the world? You're not worshipping an idol, I will kill you. Did Greco-Roman culture, do they do that? If they conquered, it was for practical things. I want money. So then there's some middle ground possible. But if you're conquering because you believe it's your divine duty, there is no middle ground. Right? Because you will come with that much aggression. Why am I giving you this entire thing, this entire background? Because what is so precious and beautiful of the Indian way, the only way from the Bronze Age pagan cultures which has survived, every other Bronze Age pagan culture has been massacred out of existence. India is the only one that survives. And what makes us so intrinsically liberal is our belief that in multiple truths. We don't believe in the concept of false gods. What do you mean false gods? Your God is true for you, my God is true for me. We don't believe in the concept that the goddess is false. Do you notice in English, which obviously follows from a culture of the one male god, the male god is written with a capital G, but the female goddess is written with a small g. Do you notice that? It's a grammar rule. It's a grammar rule. I break that grammar rule in my books. I refuse to follow it. But there are many Indians who are Hindus, okay, but who will refuse to publish my excerpts because I write goddess with a capital G. I kid you not. Okay. What is the philosophical grounding of that attitude? The one male god is true, goddess, not true. No need for respect. That is the belief from which it emerges. In Sanskrit, the male god, the female goddess, same term, same respect. No disrespect for the goddess. Right? This is the philosophical grounding. Now, if you know this, then there is no concept of this is the only true story. That concept doesn't exist only. Hari Ananta, Hari Katha Ananta. There are multiple forms of the divine, and therefore there are multiple stories of the divine. There are so many versions of the Ramayana. You'd probably believe that the Lakshman Rekha is there in the Ramayana, right? You believe that?
I do.
You believe that, right? So that is the truth according to you.
That is a version of the truth, as we just learned.
In the original Valmiki Ramayana, there is no Lakshman Rekha. The original Valmiki Ramayana is not there.
Yes, yes.
Okay. There's a version of the Ramayana called the Adbhut Ramayana where goddess Sita kills Ravana. Okay. I have quoted a line from that Adbhut Ramayana in my Sita Warrior of Mithila at the beginning. And this is just the Ramayana. and which has various interpretations. You see the Puranas, you see so many things. That is the beauty of the Indian way, multiple truths. So then, how do you know what you're writing is true or not? You can never know. Only Lord Shiva will know. All you'll know is your truth. So what do I write? I write my truth. Whatever comes to me, I write. The key point is one must write with respect. Okay. So for example, there is a brilliant Sanskrit play called Pancharatra by Bhasa, the greatest Sanskrit playwright ever. You know, many of us modern Indians believe that Kalidasa is the greatest Sanskrit playwright ever. But Kalidasa himself had written in one of his plays, according to him, the greatest Sanskrit playwright ever was Bhasa. Okay. Bhasa had written what was perhaps a very famous play in his time called Pancharatra. Okay. In which the battle doesn't happen only. It's based on the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata battle doesn't happen in that Pancharatra. Okay. The entire thing is how Guru Dronacharya finds a way to make peace between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And he has to find the Pandavas. This is the Agyatwas time. That's why it's called, and he has to find them in 5 nights, hence it's called Pancharatra. Now, if you think about it, what a different approach. And the greatest Sanskrit playwright ever 2000 years ago wrote this. There are various stories like this. So, I'm not answering your question directly. I am saying that actually I'm following a very deep, ancient Indian tradition, which I think is our strength. The ability to respect different truths. The ability to not accept that truth that there is only one truth. If you don't believe it, you'll go to hell. You know, and God will burn you. Why will God do that? I mean, come on. You know, it's very childish. It's a very childish philosophy that God will burn you forever. Why? You know? Whereas we believe there are multiple truths as long as you do it with respect. That's the key thing. You must do it with respect. Right? You must do it with Shraddha. I do it with Shraddha.
I think that makes a lot of sense because, you know, when we look at history also, a lot of problems, a lot of discrepancies have happened when there has been this belief that there is one absolute truth.
Yeah,
I think it makes a lot of sense that,
the biggest massacres, the biggest mass murders in human history have been done by those who actually believe in one truth. Like the biggest mass massacres in the 20th century was done by Marxist countries. Marxism, if you read the Black Book of Communism, around 100 million people have been killed thanks to Marxism. You know, many people try and, you know, of the 20th century say, no, radical Islam killed so much. No, actually, it's actually Marxism, which has killed a massive number. But if you see Marxist philosophy, it comes from that thing of, you know, dialectical materialism. This is the one truth. And if you don't believe it, you're a counter-revolutionary. It's the same philosophy. I'm not saying it's about religion. It is about when you start believing there is only one truth. If you don't agree with me, you are evil, you are counter-revolutionary. This is the seed of extremism. But if you intrinsically imbibe this approach that you have a right to your truth and I have a right to my truth, you intrinsically become liberal. That doesn't mean you should be a doormat. Okay, if someone is forcing his truth on you, then you should fight back. But you do not force your truth on someone else. That is liberalism.
True, very true. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I feel this absolute truth concept is actually very, very exploited even nowadays. When we see, you know, the surge of social media and the surge of all of, you know, the online devices that we have. So we have this version of one truth that we keep hearing over and over again because, you know.
And you notice in this one truth philosophy, all debates become adversarial. Have you seen that? In our TV, because we've imported so much of the West into our own thinking. It is unfortunate, you know. All our TV debates, you notice it is about two sides and each side has to prove loyalty to its own side and insult the other side. That's the beginning of extremism, where you immediately start assuming that that there is nothing good in the other side. There's nothing I can learn from them. They're all pure evil.
That's what. So
there's God and there's the devil, it's a very silly, childish concept, and it leads to extremism. And we've imbibed too much of it. from the West, we need to revive our own debating traditions. There is this wonderful book called Vada by Radha Vallabh Tripathi. I have evangelized that book a lot. I've spoken to a lot of people. Please read the book. It's a complex book. It's an 800-page tome. Okay, but it speaks about India's debating traditions and knowledge systems from ancient Indian times. And it's so, if you follow that, then the purpose becomes the light of knowledge rather than the heat of debate. Where it's more about just burn each other, whereas the Vada approach is, how do I grow as a person? Okay, and learn more knowledge. We've imported too much of this adversarial thing, and which all comes from, that one truth approach. That my side is the truth. And if you don't agree with me, you're evil. It's a very, very childish, but regrettably murderous. It has led to the worst mass massacres in the last 2000 years.
Yes, and that's why today as a society we are very, very polarized. So I think we've already learned so much in this discussion, and this could go on forever. But I have one more specific question that I really want to ask you. So since as I mentioned that I was not into mythology when I started reading your books, and yet I was very, very gripped, and your unique style of story writing is very interesting for me back then. And now looking back, since I'm an architecture student, I understand why I was so involved in the nitty-gritties, and why so much of what I read back then was so gripping for me. So I have to ask you that how did you at first envision a city like Devagiri and a country like Meluha? How did that first come to you?
A lot of it is actually, look, I read a lot. I read at least 5-6 books per month, and I've been reading at that pace for decades. A lot of it is genuine, actually, research. So the way I describe the cities of Meluha is actually reasonably accurate to how the Indus Saraswati civilization was, how the cities were actually built. But a lot of my imagination also got added to it. So you can say, kind of part research, and I read a lot, like I said, and I travel a great deal as well. In my view, traveling is one of the best ways to kind of expand your knowledge. Right? So, and whenever I travel, I like to travel as a local, so that I can get I can actually get to understand. I can get to understand, local nuances a lot more. That's how you learn, right? So, for example, the gates of Branga in Secret of the Nagas was inspired by. Dropped a glass. So, was inspired by something I'd learned in the Corinthian Peninsula, Greece, many years before. So, a lot of it was traveling, a lot of it was research, a lot of it my own imagination.
I think it was very, very beautifully explained. A lot of nuances in it, and that's why it was so gripping for me.
Thank you. So, but one thing, since you're an architecture student, one of the things I always speak of, try and get more Indian techniques into our buildings and our
landscapes
and our cities, because I mean what I learned of ancient Indian architecture, and then I described in my books, those are techniques which are suitable to the Indian way. The idea of having a courtyard in between inside the building, it aids air circulation.
Yes.
Using natural bricks, and those are standard things. And again, we are importing too many Western concepts, which are not practical in India. Like I'm in London, so you see a lot of glass wall buildings out here, which makes sense in London because there's a shortage of the sun. It's cold. You have a glass wall building, the heating bill goes down because it becomes naturally hotter. But in India, glass wall building, in London, there's a shortage of the sun. India, there's the sun all the time.
That's actually the topic of discussion in many of us.
It makes no sense. We're blindly importing Western things, which make no sense to the Indian reality, Indian climate. an architecture friend of mine had said very rightly that building a glass wall building in India is actually like building a giant microwave oven, because it just naturally heats up so much at the sides close to the glass wall. So you have to blast AC from inside, raising your electricity costs, everything. And how do we make we should learn from the West. There's a lot to learn from the West, but how do we make our things more, our knowledge systems, everything more aligned to Indian realities rather than blindly aping the West?
Very true. So, back then, 8 years ago, when I was reading your books, I was actually also parallelly reading Dan Brown. And even though both of your styles are very drastically different, but there's one.
I see the books to your side. I see the book.
Yes. So there's one thin line that I felt was a little similar, was how fiction and facts go together in sort of both of your books. So I really wanted to ask you, we have talked about how much you read and how much you research. So it must be an exhaustive process. And I sometimes also write on the side, and I understand that if you're writing something that is very factual and it needs rechecking, how did you manage to stay on this track for so long? And I read in one of your interviews that you aim to write like 100 books. So what really drives you to write so much every day and in so much depth?
It's what I love. Yeah, it's what keeps me sane. I truly love writing, and I truly love reading. So somehow all the research, everything just remains in my mind. And my average, rough ratio is for every page that I write, I read at least 100 pages. That's my rough ratio. And when I'm writing fiction, then the knowledge, the research is just like ingredients. It's up to, because Lord Shiva kind of puts a story together, so it's up to him how it forms together in the story. I don't have to go back to refer. I don't do research while writing. Anything that I'm doing while not writing, in my mind, is research, right? So I keep reading all that. But while writing, no, I don't refer back. When I write non-fiction, then it's different. Then, of course, so I've written some non-fiction. I've written one non-fiction book. There'll be another non-fiction book coming out in a few months. So there, of course, yes, one refers. But while writing fiction, no. That knowledge is all there in the back, and it kind of comes together depending on how Lord Shiva wills it.
That's so wonderful to listen, because as a reader, I always imagined, people writing such detailed accounts would be like detectives, that they would, have a flow chart, go onto the board and then write. So that's
I have nothing, no notes, no flow charts, nothing. And in fact, it's not just that I write a series. There are connections between different series. There are clues I left in Immortals of Melua, which released in 2010. Which were tied up in Ravan, which released in 2019.
Yes.
And I'll be lying if I say I had this master plan, and no, there's nothing like that. It all just remains in here, and somehow the connections just emerge. How it emerges, I don't know. It's Lord Shiva's magic. I just go with the flow.
That's wonderful.
Amish, one last question from our side, and then we go on to the interactive round. I've been always wanted to ask all the authors who come in, especially you, I would like to ask that what are the responsibilities of a writer to themselves, to the society, and to the readers? I mean, coming from you will be, I love to know from you. What do you think while writing?
To themselves, really a wonderful line, to thine own self be true. So write the book with the honesty of your heart. Realize it's a voice of your soul. You write what feels right to you. Care a damn about what others might think. Because if your purpose is to make money or to be famous, there are much easier routes. Few writers might make more money than they imagined, or get fame. But look, 99.9% of the writers don't even make enough to pay the bills at the end of the month. Most of them have to have a job on the side, or they're dependent on mommy and daddy, leaving enough money for them. Right. So it should be the voice of your soul. That is the most critical thing. If you've received a book as a blessing, it is because it serves a purpose in your life. Right? And what is your duty to society and to the readers, together? if you're writing a book, if you're putting some thoughts out there, you must leave the world slightly better than what you found. Look at it that way, right? So one of the things in the ancient Indian way is that a story without a philosophy is as pointless as a body without a soul. Right? So we must have some philosophies as authors in the books. Whether the readers get it or not, whether they agree with it or not, that's their choice. But the author must infuse the books with his philosophy. And ideally, hopefully, those philosophies, those thoughts must be something that at least leaves the society in a better place, makes sense, and make sense of some things. Make your own small contribution. None of us are so big that we'll change society. There are, some who think that, but no author is that big. But we all have to make our own small contribution and try and make a positive contribution.
I must say, Amish, you're making a lot of difference, and you're making a lot of bigger differences in everybody's life. And I will come back to you once again, but right now we need to go into the interactive round. There are a lot of authors waiting for you. I'll start with Sandeep. Shreya, will you please unmute Sandeep? Sandeep Unithan is the executive editor of India Today magazine. He writes for military, defense, and national security issues. And he's a bestseller author of Operation X and Black Tornado. And he's been with us in the author interaction rounds as well. Yes, Sandeep.
Yeah, no, I certainly don't need an introduction to Sandeep. I know him and I've read some of his work and I'm a fan. So Sandeep, pleasure meeting you, man.
Thanks, Amish. Great speaking to you, and thanks very much for that talk. It's really eye-opening. And I must add that I did my ancient Indian culture from St. Xavier's, so history is part of mine. Wow. Yeah, just 2 years before you, I think. So my question, Amish, basically is on the way history is taught in schools. Now, my ICSE textbook from Bombay in the late 80s had exactly one chapter on the Cholas, Pandyas, Pallavas, and Rashtrakutas, right? And one of these empires had a 1,000-year mercantile maritime. Yeah, the Chola, and it's there in your latest book, right? It's there in Suhail Dev. So my point is that do we need to reinterpret the way we are teaching history to our kids in schools and in colleges, free of a regional bias? I mean, I'm not speaking of it as, say, from someone from the South, but someone who is now looking back at dynasties that understood maritime commerce and, expeditions and trade and the importance of all this. We are not teaching this to our, present generation. So do you see a need to reinterpret the way we are looking at history, the way it's taught to us?
I have spoken of this a few times. In fact, I had written some articles on this also. It is desperately needed, for us to relook at our history. There are various problems with the way history is taught to us. One, as Sanjeev Sanyal, the principal economic advisor, had said once, that the history that is taught to us is more the history of our invaders rather than our own ancestors who fought those invaders, which is very bizarre. Most countries will study their own ancestors first. The second thing is an excessive Delhi bias in our history books, and this was of course there during British times, not as much, but it has got desperately accentuated in the last 70 years. Perhaps because most of the historians, came from Lutyens' Delhi, so that they just wrote of what they saw, and what they thought was the center of the Indian subcontinent. I'm not denying the importance of Delhi. It is of course a very important region of India, but it is not the only important region of India. There are many other regions, and it's not just the south that is ignored. Western India is ignored, Central India is ignored, Eastern India is ignored, Northwestern India is ignored. Raja Suhail Dev was from Central UP. He's also ignored. And if you see the way our history books were, unless an empire had its base in Delhi, you'll notice on average it's been wiped out from our history books. You know, except for a few cases where the empire was so massive that it couldn't be ignored. The Mauryas, their center was Bihar. But they were too massive to be ignored because they are the biggest empire ever in Indian history. And in terms of population, perhaps and as a population, as a percentage of the globe, perhaps one of the biggest ever, right? And in India, subcontinent, certainly, the biggest ever. They couldn't be ignored, even though their center was in Delhi. Too big to be ignored. Guptas, again, their center was Bihar, but again, too big to be ignored, right? But you notice outside of that, if an empire like the Cholas, for example, Rajendra Chola's empire was bigger than that of Akbar's, right? He controlled all of South India, all of East India, Sri Lanka, most of Southeast Asia. So his empire was bigger than Akbar's. You won't get that impression by reading our history books, right? Depending on how you measure it, the third biggest or the fourth biggest empire ever in India were the Marathas. But again, completely airbrushed out of our history books, right? Because their center wasn't Delhi. The Pandyas, the Cheras, the Hoysalas, the Rashtrakutas, the Gurjar Pratiharas were, and the ones I listed till now were the south. Gurjar Pratiharas were Gujarat, Maharashtra. That was their base, so they expanded a lot out. The Palas, who were Bengal, based off Bengal, but had conquered much of India. The Karkotaks from Kashmir, Maharaja Ranjit Singh. How much is written? You'll notice anyone who didn't have a base in Delhi whose center wasn't Delhi. The Mughals were, of course, massive. They should be covered. But Lodhis were glorified zamindars, right? Why are they given so much airtime? Correct. Whereas Marathas and others are ignored. So there's an excessive Delhi centricity among all our establishment historians. This needs to be challenged for the good of India. Because it is not fair. There are other parts of India too, boss. And I'm saying again, this complaint is not just from the south. It is from every region which is more than 100 kilometers away from Delhi. Okay. They've just been ignored. And so one, fairness. Second, it gives us a very inadequate understanding of our history. Because our history books are so Delhi centered, we think India has actually been an agrarian land-based culture. No, India was largely a maritime culture. We were the biggest traders for most of human history. We were the center of the Indian Ocean trade routes, which was the center of global trade. Right? Logical reason for it, because we keep being told that the Silk Route was where most trade happened. अरे यार, camels oxen पे कितना आप carry करोगे भाई? You can't have a big trade route based on camels, right? For big massive trade you need ships. Okay, and the Indian Ocean is the only ocean in the world where the winds change direction. Okay, the only one. All other oceans, winds go only in one direction. So before steam engines emerged, and it was all wind-based sailing, this was a huge competitive advantage for Indian Ocean because you could set up an annual round trip. It is not possible in any other sea. In the Mediterranean Sea, you needed slaves, in galleys to row. In India, why did India not have slaves in ancient times? Megasthenes wrote, right? That slavery was very common. Slavery came to India with the Turks, actually. We didn't have slavery in ancient India. Megasthenes wrote of it. And I'm not trying to say we were more moral. Okay. It's just that slavery wasn't so much used in farming pre-American times. When the mass things happened. Slavery was used in shipping to row.
The galleys.
Right? The galleys. And you needed to row because you couldn't depend on the wind. Whereas Indian Ocean, the only ocean in the world where the winds change direction, northeast monsoon, southwest monsoon, you can set up an annual round trip. You didn't need slaves. You could just use So the point is, we were a massive trading nation because of our geopolitical advantages. You don't get this impression reading our history books.
Absolutely not. Our books
You
are
think we're a land base, hum to kisano ke desh the. That is the only impression you get. Correct? Because we've ignored all our trading. The Mughals didn't have ships. Oh, that's because they came from Central Asia, boss. And the Mughals weren't Indians. They were foreigners. They were Turks. They didn't call themselves Mughals. They called themselves Temuria. We call them Mughal. They were descendants of Temur. That's what they call themselves. So the point is, there are real impacts of history being taught to us in this way. It's not just unfairness. We have an inadequate understanding of our own history, of our own selves. And because we don't see ourselves as a trading nation, you'll notice trading nations tend to be more outgoing, more confident, more because, you naturally engage with other cultures. You're not defensive. You're outgoing. You're pushing out. Whereas we don't have that self-image. Like when pre-1991 we chose socialism and chose to withdraw from trade, withdraw from the world. No one argued saying, boss, you're going against 5,000 years of our culture. Because we didn't see ourselves as traders. We see ourselves as Delhi-focused farmers.
farmers. That's right.
As an agrarian society. There's a real impact of our history as well. It's not just fairness. It's not just about fairness. It needs to be rewritten. Certainly needs to be rewritten.
Thanks so much, Amish. I think you've answered my question perfectly. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandeep. Next we have Ashish. Ashish Bhandari, in fact, is a very, very popular voice artist. He's a podcaster and a media consultant. Ashish, in fact, he picked up reading because of you, Amish.
Oh, thanks.
Yes.
Thanks,
Hi, Amish. It's an honor to talk to you. I must confess that I was a very, very poor reader all my life. And I realized that there is a problem related to text till I saw the movie Tare Zameen Par. It's called dyslexia.
Yeah, dyslexia.
So my word letters would jumble up and I couldn't focus on reading even newspaper. Okay. But then someone suggested that I start reading something that appeals to you, something that connects with you. So I got my hands on your books and I read the entire Shiva trilogy, very good pace. And I'm right now on this book in the Ramchandra series. So it's an honor because I somehow did this whole topic of Indian culture and mythology resonated with me, which was a reason also that I started my own podcast based on Indian culture stories. It's called Back to the Roots, wherein I share, small short stories about our, important festivals, important events, and important personalities. So my question to you, let me just quickly take it out so that I don't miss out on anything. Firstly, there is in today's generation, I would say that I'm 38 right now, and sometimes I felt this challenge myself in a discussion or an argument to like for example, in my previous organization, someone asked me that why do you worship Ram? He abandoned his wife. He was not a good husband. He was not a good brother. So he didn't set a very good example. I didn't know what to say. I believe in Ram, but I didn't have any points to defend Ram. So there is a generation, our generation is divided into, say, pure rationals who would even question the existence of our, mythological stories. Mahabharata didn't happen, Ramayana didn't happen. It's just a, fictional story. And on the other hand, we have people who blindly follow a lot of our customs without actually knowing the whole story behind them. So my question to you is that what's your message to both the sides of the generation, and are you through your fiction somehow trying to establish a balance here?
In the traditional Indian way, there's nothing wrong with being an atheist. Because faith wasn't enforced. Lack of faith wasn't seen as a rebellion either. You'll find in the modern West, you'll find that atheists tend to be as extremists as religious extremists. You'll notice that. They will come and judge religious people, make fun of them. No, my reaction is chill, yaar, what is your problem? Right? Why is that? Because their atheism is a rebellion against a one truth church. So they're like, no, I must, this is the only way I can fight. In India, atheism wasn't a rebellion against one truth because there was no one enforcing one truth. Atheism was just your choice. No, I don't. And faith is not so important in the dharmic in the dharmic way. Yeah. Dharmic religions are what? Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, which have a common philosophical root. But I genuinely believe Indian Islam, Indian Christianity are also qualitatively different from how Islam and Christianity are practiced in other parts of the world. Only an Indian Muslim could have said, "Ya to sharab mein peene de sakhi, aisi jagah bata jahan khuda na ho." Okay. So there's that appreciation for different truths that comes in. So then from the Indian perspective, if atheism and faith is not a problem, then what is your task? Okay, your job is essentially to find your truth, your spiritual truth, right? It's not to judge others and tell them your truth is wrong and you need to follow my truth, correct? So therefore, if someone doesn't choose to believe in Lord Ram or Lord Krishna, their choice, nothing wrong with it. In the traditional Indian schools, for example, Sankhyas, Mimamsas, who are our ancient schools of philosophy, these are Hindu schools of philosophy, Sankhya, Mimamsas, they don't believe in a creator God. Bodha, Jaina, which is Buddhist Jainism, they don't believe in a creator God. So then from the modern perspective, they're atheists. Like Charvaks, which is a Hindu school, they did not believe in a creator God. So they're atheists, right? Your task is to understand what your role in life is, what your Swadharma is, and atheist will find his own journey. Since you asked on Lord Ram, let me try and explain that concept to you. Right? If you don't believe in the one truth, then you have to understand that the way we look at our gods and goddesses is to see them as role models of a particular way of life, and then learn from that. Like Lord Krishna is a different way of life. Lord Ram is a different way of life. Lord Shiva is a different way of life. What is the way of life that Lord Ram represents? He's called Maryada Purushottam, right? Which is erroneously translated as perfect man at times. Yeah. Maryada Purushottam actually means the perfect follower of laws. That is the way of life he represents. So when you look at a role model like this, the strengths of a role model like this is such people or gods tend to be fantastic leaders for their society, because they'll put the law above everything else. But such people normally tend to have very unhappy personal lives. Again, and there is, like I said, that if there is no one perfect truth, you'll realize every way of life has its strengths and areas of improvement. And you learn from that role model, apply the lesson in your own life. Lord Ram was not the only ideal follower of laws. Gautam Buddha was an ideal follower of laws. Mahatma Gandhi was an ideal follower of laws. And you notice the common thread between all of them? Fantastic leaders who did so much good for society. Millions of people even today benefit from the philosophies they led. What are their personal lives like? Each and every one of them. There is no judgment in the Indian way. Just this is the way of life Lord Ram represents. There's another way of life which is the polar opposite of the Lord Ram way of life, which is the Dhritarashtra way of life. Okay, which is Putra Moh. That is, care a damn about laws, care a damn about the country. I will do everything for my child. Again, no judgment in the Indian way. We've had leaders like that too, no? They're willing to sacrifice 1.3 billion people for their child. Now, again, no judgment, no judgment. When you look at them, you'll think, wow, fantastic mother, fantastic father. As leaders, right? Whereas Lord Ram, what a leader, what a god. But can his family very rightly raise complaints on him? Yes, Goddess Sita can. Love and Kush can. And again, in the Indian way, there's no judgment. So you learn from that. If you are inspired by a life of laws, as some of our leaders are also, you'll notice among the most powerful and popular leaders in Indian democratic history, have you noticed they've usually been singles? Not just male and female. Have you noticed that? Why is that? Because somewhere in our society we as followers, we want a Lord Ram rather than a Dhritarashtra for a leader. Right? Because a Dhritarashtra will sacrifice us for his family. Lord Ram will sacrifice his family for us. So as followers, we will be selfish. We want a Lord Ram. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have few more questions. I hope you can give us some more time. I don't know
5 minutes.
Can you give us some more time if it is possible?
Yeah, 5 minutes. 5 minutes, is it okay? Yeah, okay.
A little more, if it is okay. I have some
No, I
more
have another
questions.
thing to get into. Sorry.
Shreya, can you unmute Preeta? Preeta, in fact, she's the director of Ankh Theatre Group, and she's a very leading theatre artist. Yeah, Preeta. Sure.
I think, okay, she's here.
Hi, Mishi.
Hi,
Really
Preeta.
nice. Very
Thank
nice.
you. Thank you.
I'll just quickly come to the question because I'm sure a lot of other people are also waiting. I just wanted to know that you've picked up Sohail Dev, such a lesser known figure in the history of the country. Have you any plans to pick up some more lesser known people whom we can come to know?
Yeah, there are, because I think we modern Indians do the worst that can be done to our heroes and heroines. See, our heroes and heroines, they don't expect us to be as brave as they are. They know we are not. They will go and fight. Like we have heroes right now, our soldiers on the front who are fighting. They don't expect us to stand next to them. We are not that brave. We also know that. But what they expect is we must remember their stories. The worst thing we can do to our heroes and heroines is forget them. And modern Indians have done that. We have done that crime. It's not just King Sohail Dev. So many others who fought and bled for India. We've forgotten them. King Martanda Varma,
Yes,
Lachit Borphukan, Queen Tarabai,
that's right.
Abakka Rani. The 30-year war that the Marathas fought. There are so many great heroes and heroines like this. We must remember their stories, we must revive them, and we must be inspired by them. So I'll hope to make my own small contribution reviving many of these stories. But I hope there are more and more. You guys are all right. Excuse me. You guys are all writers. Please revive these stories. We must hear these positive, stories of unity. When we Indians are united, we are freaking unbeatable. The problem is we are usually divided. The problem with us Indians is we are almost like we are looking for some excuse to start fighting with each other. The only time we stop fighting is when we see an enemy right at our door. Like we have a certain neighbor who's trying to invade us right now. So hopefully there's some moment of unity right now. But you'll notice often whenever we've lost battles, it's because of our own internal divisions. Not because of lack of courage or resources. No, it's just our internal divisions. And these stories of our heroes and heroines will create that unity.
Thank you. I look forward to more lesser known people taking the limelight now.
Thank you. Thank you, Rita.
One very, very quick question from Dr. Neeta Dabai. She is a postgraduate physician and she's been working on maternal health with WHO. Yes, Neeta.
Yeah, so hi.
Hi.
I am an absolute fan of yours. I've read every book you have written. And recently was, of course, Sohail Dev. And I just wanted to ask a very quick question again. You have propounded religious secularism in your book, when there are dialogues between Abdul and the other Turks.
And Ashwa Ghosh and various others. Yeah.
And so I wanted to know, was this a fact at those times, or is this a deliberate attempt in view of the recent communal violence as a part of your artistic liberty?
I don't know if it was a fact. At times we were united, at times we were divided. Whether in this particular instance, if it happened, I don't know. But, as I was saying earlier, what is the primary duty of an author? I find so many authors, they think that creating conflict and creating fights is somehow their honest, it brings out their honesty and their rebelliousness and their liberalism. Like, why would you want to make your society worse off than it is? Why can't you be a source of positivity? Is this, can it be called naivety? Can it be called excessive optimism. Yeah, of course, one can be called all that. But I like to contribute positively to the society. And is this a message that is needed? Is this a message that is good? That all of us should be united. I'm not saying that all of us have to convert to one way of life. No, we all have a right to our way of life. And we will, of course, have our debates. As we should. Yeah, we are Indians. We are basically a rebellious people. We are not a compliant people. Right? But at times of fast change, at times of danger, as today's age is, it's good for us to be united. So I'm trying to kind of support that message. Having said that, were there instances where we were united? Yes, we were. For example, Peshwa Bajirao had in his army, he had Muslims and Hindus. Sadly, we weren't taught anything about Peshwa Bajirao. Most Indians wouldn't have heard of Peshwa Bajirao if Sanjay Leela Bhansali hadn't made his movie. It shows the quality of our historians. But so it did happen at times. Right? And at times it didn't happen. At times we were divided. That's also true. But I want to make a positive contribution to a country that I deeply love.
No, that was very great. And I was just wondering whether it was real. But that message has come loud and clear, and I think very well taken by everybody. And it is actually very much needed, especially at this time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Take one last question. How does it go with you? I think you had a meeting.
Okay, I'll take this last question and then I'll rush. That's okay? Yeah. Okay.
Vinita, you wanted to ask? Vinita Bakshi? Can you unmute yourself? She's the author of 31 Miles, and I think she was there with you at the Jaipur Literature Festival as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Namaste, Amishji. Such an honor to have you, and I can't believe that I'm asking you a question. It's a real privilege, Neeta, and thank you, Amishji. My question to you is, many questions have dissipated because I have got my answers. You so eloquently, Shreya asked questions and Uninathan, and I got my answers. But just, going beyond mythology. So generally, I'm the one who would always recommend my mother some book to read, but my mother, when she was 77 and I was visiting her, she gave me, Shiva Trilogy and Meluhas, and she said, I have never read a book in my life. And she said, have you read it? And she was so excited. And I think that was my, I've always been very, very fascinated by mythology, but it was an absolute treat, a delight to, go through that book. And then, of course, the journey has continued. So, you are someone who brought this new energy into the mythology writing. So for a very long time, people had not written. And then after you, there was a whole, there were so many more authors who are writing mythology, and it has, come back in a big way. Mythology is a genre, and we always look forward to, what you're saying, and, how, as you also said, there's a lot of research for one single page. You read 100 pages. So do you ever think of going beyond this genre, mythology, and or?
Yeah, I already have. I mean, actually, no, even this is historical fiction. I write even my, that also is historical fiction.
Yeah,
but
right.
I do have a story idea in mind. Look, I don't think I'll write campus romance novels. Those ideas don't strike me, sorry. But I think there is a story idea in my mind which is set in the modern day, which is based on time travel, actually. Time travel and gaming and alien life. So I hope to get down to that also. So let's see. Once I finish Ramchandra series.
Yes. And of course, I'm really hoping, and I'm sure most of us are hoping that with Suhail Dev and with this new education policy, we are going to read many forgotten heroes. Because as you very rightly said, that we have been reading invaders' history. We've not read about our own heroes and different regions of India. The history we've read is only about a few dynasties and very Delhi-centric.
True.
So I'm very happy that somebody's been voicing that out. And, again, I completely concur, and I could not have said in better words what you said, that ours is the only religion where a believer and atheist are not too juxtaposed, opposite each other.
They're not in conflict.
Yes, it makes room for a believer and equally for a non-believer. So if you look at Upanishads, there are so many times, they are also called Vedantas, and they are a question, they are a critique sometimes of what is written in Vedas. So in that sense, we are continuously inventing and reinventing ourselves, and that is what makes us a very great civilization and a great religion. I mean, I might be...
Our approach is we are seeking to learn.
Yes.
Rather than convincing others of our belief.
Yes. Yes.
So our entire fundamental approach is different. It's a more intellectual approach.
Yes.
Rather than this is the truth, and if you don't agree with me, I will kill you or convert you. I mean, it's very childish. It's a very childish approach. So, but
you said everything so beautifully that I have ever thought.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anita. Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Amish. We still have very, very important 3 people who've been wanting to ask, but I think you have another meeting.
Sorry.
We have Mercy Tetsuo joining us from Nagaland. We have Roma Ghosh, who's another author, and Mr. Vinayak Sapre. I wish you had more time.
Mercy and Vinayak
and Roma.
And Roma, I am so sorry. My sincere apologies. The event took a little longer than expected. My sincere apologies for this. I have another event, in fact, actually another meeting, and they just opened the door. They checked already. I'm so sorry, so I have to go. If you'll just excuse me this time, the next time I come, I promise to take your questions first.
Okay. I send you their questions.
My sincere apologies.
Amish, thank you so much for taking us time. I know it's been so busy for you since the the movies coming out, your new book promotions, and you still could take out time for us. This is amazing. And we had a wonderful session. It was amazing to hear you. All of us are having goosebumps right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining.
Bye, guys. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Amish. Thank you so much. Bye. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. It's been a pleasure to have you all back again and again. And we'll have Mr. Vinayak Sapre is coming in next. He's a financial coach and he's an author of a very interesting book. And sorry, Mercy, and sorry, Roma. Sorry, Mr. Vinayak, and sorry, Sandeep. I mean, there are a lot of questions we got, but he had another meeting planned. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining in, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.